The heat clung to everything: canvas roofs, bare feet, even the breath of those who dared to speak. It was 1943, deep in Sumatra, where the sun didn't rise, it struck. At roll call, the Japanese sergeant's voice cut through the heavy air like a blade. Choose one child. For a moment, the world went silent. Mothers froze mid-motion, hands still gripping rice bowls, eyes wide as if language itself had betrayed them. The interpreter hesitated. He thought he'd misheard, but the sergeant repeated, slower this time, each word hitting like gunfire. 600 women and children stood in the open yard of the internment camp, a patch of cleared jungle fenced with bamboo and wire. The women, mostly British and Dutch civilians captured after the fall of Singapore, were already starved, their skin stretched thin, their dignity threadbare. But this order was something different. It wasn't about control or punishment. It was a test of their very humanity. One woman whispered, "He can't mean it." Another clutched both her children, pressing their faces into her chest as if her heartbeat could drown the words. The guards watched, unmoving. Even they seemed uncertain how to enforce a command that felt inhuman. Somewhere in the line, a child began to cry, that high-pitched sound that pierces even the hardest soldier. Reports later said the mortality rate in these camps hovered above 30%. Hunger was a constant executioner. But today's order was psychological, designed to break what starvation couldn't. One guard, younger than the rest, muttered to his comrade in Japanese, "Even our men wouldn't bear such cruelty." He looked away quickly, ashamed that empathy had escaped his lips. Time stretched. No mother moved. Sweat dripped onto bare feet. A crow landed on the fence and cawed, indifferent. Then finally, a figure stepped forward, a woman with short hair and hollow eyes. She held the hands of two thin children and looked straight at the sergeant. Her lips trembled, but her voice didn't. "You want me to choose?" The sergeant blinked. For the first time, he seemed unsure. Around her, every prisoner held their breath, waiting to see whether resistance or surrender would define them next. The woman's choice, whatever it would be, was the moment the camp's soul began to fracture. The silence deepened, as if the jungle itself leaned closer to listen. Before that command shattered the camp, there had been the sea roaring, burning, and full of bodies. February 1942, Singapore was falling, the sky alive with Japanese bombers. Allied ships crowded the harbor, desperate to flee south. Among them was the WWII, carrying nurses, civilians, and children hope packed into steel and smoke. The engines trembled as they pulled away from shore, but escape was an illusion. Within hours, Japanese planes swooped low, their machine guns stitching death across the water. Vivian Bullwinkle, a young Australian Army nurse, remembered the sound of bullets cutting through lifeboats. The sea turned red, she later told investigators. The WWII sank fast. Survivors, mostly women, drifted on wreckage through the Strait of Bangka. Salt burned their eyes, oil slicked their skin. When dawn broke, they saw the shore of Sumatra. Land meant life. They were wrong. A patrol of Japanese soldiers found them by midday. The men were separated immediately. The women, still in their blood-stained uniforms, were ordered to the beach. What happened next would echo for decades, the Bangka Island massacre. 22 nurses lined up at the water's edge were machine-gunned. Only one survived, Vivian. She fell into the tide, pretended to be dead, and drifted away with the bodies of her friends. For a day and a night, she floated, wounded, half-conscious. When she was found, she was too weak to resist capture. The Japanese considered these women combatants in disguise. In reports, they called them Ana-Haishi, women soldiers. To them, mercy was weakness. We saw them as soldiers in skirts. One Japanese officer later admitted. That belief justified every blow that followed. From the coast, the prisoners were marched inland miles through mosquito, choked jungle, and flooded paddies. Some barefoot, some carrying others who could no longer walk. Behind them, the smoke of Singapore still rose on the horizon, a reminder of everything they'd lost. By the time they reached the camp in Palembang, they were hollow-eyed, fevered, and too numb to imagine things could get worse. But war had its own creativity when it came to cruelty. None of them knew that a year later, inside that same camp, a new order would demand something even darker than surrender. The woman who had once floated among corpses would soon face a question no soldier could answer. By the time the prisoners reached Sumatra's internment camp, the jungle had already begun to eat them alive. The air was thick, humid enough to drown in. Mosquitoes swarmed like smoke. Bamboo huts leaned under their own weight. For the captured women and children, this was not a camp. It was a slow erasure. Every morning began with roll call barefoot on mud still slick from the night's rain. Every night ended with the hiss of fever and the quiet counting of who didn't wake up. They called it Palembang Women's Internment Camp. The guards called it re-education, but inside it was starvation with structure. Rations shrank to a handful of rice husks, sometimes 300 calories a day, barely enough to keep breath inside bone. Meat was a memory, clean water a rumor. Mothers soaked rice in swamp water just to make it look more. Latrines overflowed. The smell of dysentery mixed with kerosene fires. Some women cut their hair short to keep lice from nesting. Others stitched bandages out of torn mosquito nets. Still, they kept each other alive in fragments, sharing whatever they could hide. The Japanese commandant believed hunger was a tool. He said, discipline must grow from emptiness, and it did. The women learned to walk slower, speak less, conserve even their tears. Children grew silent. You could measure time in their shrinking faces. In the guard huts, reports were filed with cold precision. 3 dead of fever, 2 from diarrhea, 1 suicide. No emotion, just arithmetic. But one line in a guard's private log showed a crack. They should die quietly. He wrote it as if pleading with ghosts to obey. Amid this despair, rumors began to spread. A new order was coming. Some said it was about labor, others about population control. Each whisper made the mothers hold their children tighter. In the jungle beyond the fence, cicadas screamed like sirens. One night, a woman dreamed of hearing her name called. In her dream, she was told to choose between her 2 children. When she woke, her pillow was wet. She laughed it off. Madness, she said. But within days, her nightmare would become an announcement. The bamboo gate creaked open at dawn. The officers stepped inside, carrying papers. The women already knew something was wrong. It began with a whistle, sharp, metallic, final. The prisoners formed rows in the muddy courtyard, the same place they buried their dead. The Japanese officer stepped forward, paper in hand, boots polished so clean they reflected faces hollowed by hunger. His translator stood beside him, nervous, sweating. Then came the words that would brand the camp forever. Each woman with 2 children choose one. For a moment the interpreter froze. He didn't translate. He thought maybe he'd misheard. The officer barked again, louder, his voice snapping through the humid air. The words hit the women like shrapnel. A collective gasp rippled through the line's mothers clutching their children, as if the act itself could undo the command. Even the guards looked unsettled. They'd seen executions, beatings, hunger, but this was different. It wasn't physical punishment. It was designed to crush the spirit. One interpreter whispered under his breath, "We are soldiers, not monsters," but no one answered. There were about 90 mothers in that camp who had 2 children. Babies who still cried at night and older ones who understood too much. They had shared everything: bowls, blankets, hope, but now the war demanded a choice between blood and breath. The officer waited, face expressionless. No one moved. Minutes stretched. Flies gathered around open sores. One woman fainted. Another began to laugh uncontrollably, the sound so sharp it made even the guards step back. The officer repeated the order. His tone grew colder, mechanical, as if reading a grocery list. "If you do not choose, we will." Still silence. The mothers stared back, defiance trembling behind tears. It wasn't courage, they were simply beyond fear. The Japanese didn't understand it. Obedience to them was sacred. Disobedience was chaos. Yet here, in a muddy courtyard, chaos stood in rows and refused to bow. Finally, the officer signaled the guards. The translator's hands shook as he folded the list. He muttered, "They will regret this," but he didn't sound convinced. The women didn't move, didn't cry. They just stared as if memorizing his face, so they could remember the man who tried to make them choose. Behind the fence, the jungle hummed. The sun began to set, bleeding red across the camp. And in that dying light, the women's silence became something dangerous unity. The night that followed would test how long silence could hold. The night after the order, the camp didn't sleep. You could hear whispers floating between the bamboo walls, broken prayers, muffled sobs, the faint rustle of feet pacing in the dark. Mothers clung to their children as if holding them tighter could keep fate from noticing. The guards' lanterns swung outside like restless stars, throwing light across faces that looked carved from bone. Vivian Bullwinkle sat near the infirmary, her uniform long turned to rags. She'd survived machine guns, drowning, and months of starvation. But this order had shaken something deeper. She looked at the feverish children lying on straw mats and whispered to another nurse, "They expect us to become like them." The other nurse didn't answer. She was spooning water into a child's cracked lips, one drop at a time. Rations had been cut again, 1 cup of rice water for an entire family. Some mothers bartered jewelry, wedding rings, even shoes, trading everything for a few extra grains to keep both children alive. Others simply lied to the guards, claiming one of their kids had already died. It worked, for a day or two. But starvation doesn't negotiate. Within 2 weeks, dysentery ripped through the camp like wildfire. The infirmary overflowed. The smell of sickness mingled with the stench of latrines until no one could tell where life ended and decay began. Official records from similar camps show disease rates tripling after food ration cuts. Here, it was worse. Reports suggest over 30 new cases a week. Yet amid all that suffering, the women still shared what they could. One guard wrote in his diary, "They still share food." Madness. By dawn, one mother was found collapsed near the latrine trench, her child still in her arms. They said she'd been fasting for days, giving both portions to her sons. The guards removed the body without ceremony. The surviving boy wailed until his voice broke. No punishment that day. No one had the strength to enforce it. That morning, the order still stood. No one had complied. The Japanese officers met in silence, unsure what to do next. For the women, that small hesitation felt like victory, but also dread. They knew the next move would be harsher, and it would come from someone unexpected. By evening, whispers spread. Nurse Bullwinkle had done something dangerous. By the next sunrise, the camp was a fevered hive of rumors. Vivian Bullwinkle, the woman who had once survived a massacre, was defying orders again. The guards didn't know it yet, but inside the infirmary, she was hiding children marked for removal. One boy, barely 7, lay under blood-stained bandages, pretending to be sick. Another was tucked beneath a pile of rice sacks. Vivian whispered to them, "Don't move, don't make a sound." Her voice was calm, the same tone she'd used on the battlefield, except this time. There were no weapons, only willpower. The Japanese patrols searched each hut. Their boots thudded against bamboo floors, rifles glinting in the sunlight. Vivian kept her face blank, her hands steady. A guard stepped inside the infirmary, scanning the corpse. "Sick?" he asked. "All sick," she replied. The guard frowned, lifted one bandage, and saw only bone and fever. Satisfied, he moved on. When he left, Vivian exhaled so slowly it sounded like prayer. She'd been a nurse in uniform once, following military code. But now, in rags and filth, she'd found a new kind of discipline, the courage to break rules that no longer deserved obedience. Hidden, in her makeshift clinic, were 3 children spared from the selection, each life stolen back from the machinery of cruelty. Bullwinkle's defiance wasn't loud. It was quiet rebellion, precise and strategic. She bribed guards with medicine she didn't have, falsified death records, and smuggled food through the infirmary. Every act risked execution, but she'd already faced death on Banker Beach. Fear had no leverage left. In a captured diary later found after the war, one Japanese guard wrote, "That woman fears nothing, dangerous." He was right. Vivian's calm resistance infected the others. Mothers began hiding children in cooking sheds, behind laundry lines, even inside emptied rice barrels. The camp's rhythm shifted from despair to defiance. Still, the danger grew. The commandant noticed missing names on ration logs. He ordered a full inspection, promising examples will be made. The guards began whispering too. Not all of them agreed with this order. Discipline was cracking, and with it, the illusion of control. That night, near the latrine trench, a small circle of women gathered. No lights, no sound but the hum of insects. They made a pact, a promise that none would ever choose again, no matter what followed. Midnight in the camp was a living thing breathing through the hum of insects, the creak of bamboo, the muffled coughs of the dying. That night, under a bruised moon, a small group of women slipped out from their huts and gathered near the latrine trench, where the guards never lingered long. Barefoot, mud up to their ankles, they formed a circle, no torches, no sound but whispers and the slow pulse of fear. Vivian Bullwinkle stood among them, her face gaunt yet steady. "We make a promise," she said quietly. "If they ask again, we don't choose, not one of us." It wasn't rebellion in the traditional sense. It was survival repurposed as defiance. The women nodded one by one. A Dutch mother named Clara pressed her hands together and murmured, "If they want one child, they'll take us all." That line would survive in a smuggled diary found decades later under floorboards. There were around 60 women in that circle, mothers, nurses, widows, some barely 20. Each had lost too much to fear death anymore. The jungle around them hissed with unseen life. Inside the camp, infants whimpered in sleep. Every sound was a reminder of what they stood to lose. By now, the Japanese officers had begun tightening control, rations cut again, curfews enforced with rifle butts. They wanted submission. What they got was solidarity, and that terrified them more than resistance ever could. In one guard's logbook recovered after the war, a line stood out: "Western women cannot obey, that is their weakness," but he was wrong. It wasn't weakness, it was refusal to become like him. Through that night, they planned how to hide the children, share water, rotate watch duty. If anyone was taken, the others would protect her family. It was chaos turned into strategy. When dawn broke, their faces looked calmer, almost serene. From the watchtower, a Japanese sentry noticed movement in the dark. He narrowed his eyes but said nothing. The women slipped back into their huts as if nothing had happened. But something had something irreversible. The next inspection would come soon, and when it did, the pact would be tested in ways no one could predict. The morning light crept through the palm trees, slicing across the compound. The whistle for roll call was about to blow. The morning whistle screamed before the sun had cleared the treetops. The women stumbled into formation, mud sucking at their bare feet. The guards' shouts sliced through the humid air to day was inspection day. Everyone knew what that meant. Every hut, every mat, every pot turned upside down. The Japanese commandant wanted names, children unregistered, food hidden, lies uncovered. The pact was about to face its reckoning. The officers moved in lines, clipboards in hand, rifles slung casually across shoulders. Vivian stood near the infirmary door, trying to look calm. She'd burned the false records the night before. Inside, 3 children crouched beneath medical cots, silent as ghosts. The camp's translator barked orders, "Open that hut. Bring all children forward," his voice trembling more from tension than conviction. One sergeant lifted a rice sack near the cooking shed. The sound froze everyone. Inside was a boy, barely 5, covered in ash. He blinked up at the soldiers, too weak to cry. The sergeant's jaw tightened. He dragged the sack out into the open. A wave of panic rippled through the mothers. No one moved, but every pair of eyes screamed. The punishment was instant. The officer declared, 2 days no food, no water. The guards obeyed, buckets were locked away, the kitchen fires doused. For 48 hours, the prisoners endured starvation under guard watch, the children's cries fading to dry whispers. The sergeant who found the boy wrote later, "They did not beg. Even when the small ones fainted, they did not beg." By the second night, the camp was a graveyard of exhaustion. Yet the pact held, the women refused to confess or surrender the hidden children. The Japanese couldn't comprehend it. Defiance that quiet, that collective, that patient. The commandant paced outside his hut, muttering in disbelief. "We only follow orders." One guard said to another, half excuse, half regret. When food was finally restored, the mothers shared every grain evenly, refusing hierarchy even in hunger. The guards watched in silence. Something had shifted, authority had met endurance, and endurance had won the first round. But victory in that place always came at a price. By the next dawn, one mother would face a choice that would break even the pact's iron resolve. And the guards who once laughed at them would finally fall silent. Dawn broke without warmth. The air was heavy, wet, still tasting of ash from the cook fires that hadn't burned in 2 days. The prisoners gathered again for roll call, thinner, slower, hollow-eyed. The commandant arrived flanked by 2 guards, his face set in stone. The no-choice defiance had humiliated him. He needed a demonstration proof that fear still ruled. And he found it in one trembling mother. Her name, later recorded by survivors, was Els de Vries. Dutch civilian, mid-30s, 2 sons. Both small, both starving. She stood motionless in the front row, holding their hands so tightly her knuckles went white. The officer stopped before her, eyes like ice. He barked an order, the same one as before. "Choose one child," silence. Her breath hitched. Everyone around her knew what was at stake. The pact had forbidden this, no choosing, no breaking. But her youngest was feverish, barely breathing. Maybe she thought compliance could save at least one. Maybe she just broke under the weight of the impossible. Slowly, shaking, she knelt down and kissed her older boy's forehead. Then she lifted the younger one in her arms and stepped forward. The entire line froze. A sound half gasp, half sob rippled through the crowd. The Japanese officer hesitated, visibly thrown off. He had expected defiance or tears, not this obedience coated in silent accusation. Els looked up at him, eyes glassy but burning with something close to contempt. "You want one child," she said in a low voice, "then you look me in the eye when you take him." He didn't. He signaled a guard instead. The boy was taken, quietly, no screaming, just a small hand reaching back as the crowd held its breath. Els collapsed to her knees. One witness later wrote, "She fainted before the boy left her arms." The officer walked away quickly, face pale, jaw tight. One Japanese guard later confessed in a letter, "She obeyed. But her eyes accused me." That day, no one else was forced to choose. The commandant had gotten his demonstration, but not the victory he wanted. Instead, the camp fell into a silence more dangerous than open revolt. From that moment, even the guards stopped shouting. They'd seen what obedience cost. The next day, it began to rain, and the graves began to multiply. The rain came hard, as if the sky itself couldn't bear what it had seen. Within days, the camp turned into a swamp, mud knee-deep, graves caving in, fever rising like steam. Mothers wrapped their children in scraps of fabric and laid them in shallow pits. No priest, no words, just the sound of bamboo poles scraping against wet soil. Every burial felt like a betrayal, a quiet confession that hope had limits. The infirmary overflowed. Vivian Bullwinkle, hands trembling, stitched wounds that no longer healed. Dysentery ran rampant, malaria blurred the days. Reports from similar internment sites would later show child mortality surpassing 25 in a single month here. The numbers felt even worse. Vivian marked names in her notebook, not for the Japanese, but for memory. If no one remembers, she whispered, they die twice. Even the guards couldn't avoid the stench. Flies thickened over the camp like a curtain. One officer demanded more graves dug farther away from his quarters. The women, forced to do the digging, did it in silence. The soil was too soaked for decency. They used cooking pots instead of shovels. At night, you could hear soft singing hymns, lullabies, anything to quiet the children who were still alive. The guards didn't understand the words, but the sound unsettled them. It wasn't despair. It was defiance disguised as grief. One Japanese diary entry from that week reads simply, "They keep singing hymns, I cannot understand it. For the women, faith had stopped being religion, it was endurance. Their God wasn't in heaven. He was in the act of standing up every morning, of still calling their children by name, of whispering comfort to the dying when there was nothing left to give." By the third week of reign, the camp's death count had blurred into routine. The commandant stopped attending roll call. Even he knew morale was broken on both sides, yet within that ruin something flickered. Vivian noticed it first, the rhythm of the singing growing steadier, more organized. Voices weaving harmony from hunger. That spark would soon turn into their most dangerous act yet. A choir born in captivity. Music would become their rebellion, and the Japanese would have no idea how to fight it. It began with a hum, barely audible, rising from the shadows of the women's huts, thin, cracked voices blending through fevered air. At first the guards ignored it, thinking it was grief. But the hum grew into harmony, fragile yet deliberate. Music was the one weapon no one could confiscate. Vivian Bullwinkle stood in the center of it, her once steady nurse's hands now trembling with rhythm instead of fear. The women gathered in secret, using the camp's small laundry hut as their rehearsal room. They had no instruments, only memory. From fragments of Bach, Handel, and folk songs, they built what became known as the vocal orchestra. Over 40 pieces reconstructed entirely from recollection, each note a rebellion. They sang softly at night, sinking their breaths with the croak of jungle frogs to hide the sound. Ave Maria, Lago, Home Sweet Home, music that carried them beyond the wire. Children listened why, died, some too young to understand, but their faces eased when the melody swelled. Reports later confirmed this phenomenon across several POW camps. Music as resistance, morale rebuilt from air itself. But here, in Sumatra, it was more than that. It was a declaration that even starvation couldn't erase beauty. The guards didn't know what to make of it. Some tried to forbid the singing, others lingered by the huts at night, pretending to patrol while listening. One of them wrote in his private notes, "They sing like free people." That line, found decades later, was proof that the songs had reached even the enemy. The choir grew bolder. They performed during roll calls, pretending to recite names while harmonizing under their breath. Each performance risked punishment, but it became the camp's heartbeat. When one woman died, her name was added as a whispered note in the next song, a living requiem. Starvation continued, but so did the music. The women's ribs showed through their skin. Still, they stood straighter when they sang. Even the youngest prisoners learned to hum. The Japanese officers began delaying inspections. They didn't want to face those voices. By mid-1945, the songs had become prophecy. Rumors of Japan's defeat trickled through like wind through bamboo. The guards grew quieter, their posture smaller. The women didn't dare believe it yet, but something in their harmonies changed. Hope was tuning itself for a final note. It came without fanfare, no trumpets, no flags, just the sound of engines approaching from beyond the jungle. August 1945. The war was ending, though no one inside the camp dared to believe it. The guards had grown restless in the days prior, whispering about surrender. Then, one morning, they simply vanished, uniforms stripped, rifles gone, watchtowers empty. At first, the women thought it was a trap. They waited hours before stepping outside the gates. But when they did, the silence was real. No orders, no shouting. Just wind in the trees, and the faint rumble of vehicles drawing closer. Then came the moment they'd stopped imagining Allied troops in khaki uniforms, stumbling into view, staring in horror at what they found. One soldier wrote in his field diary they looked like ghosts who remembered how to stand. The women's faces were skeletal, eyes too big for their skulls. Some tried to salute out of old habit, others simply collapsed. Children clung to the rescuers' boots, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Medical teams rushed in with stretchers and supplies. The British and Australian officers wept openly. They hadn't known how bad it was. Of the original group of more than 100 children interned in Sumatra, only 32 survived. The rest were buried under crude crosses made from bamboo. When the soldiers saw those graves, even the hardened ones turned away. Vivian Bullwinkle stood near the camp gate, sunlight glaring off her hollow cheeks. Her uniform hung loose, stitched from torn canvas. A young lieutenant approached her gently, asking her name. She answered softly, "Nurse Bullwinkle, Australian Army." He froze. Her name was already legend. She'd been reported dead 3 years ago. As the women were evacuated, the Japanese captors, still hiding in the jungle, watched from a distance. One former guard later wrote, "The Emperor's War finished us all." He wasn't wrong. Liberation had come, but it didn't feel like victory, only relief so fragile it might shatter. The trucks pulled away from the camp, engines coughing through the mud. Behind them, the bamboo fences swayed in the wind, empty for the first time in years. Yet every woman knew freedom wouldn't erase what had happened inside those walls. Vivian looked back once, eyes fixed on the graves, whispering to no one, "We made it, not all, but enough to tell it." The war ended, but the silence didn't. For years, the survivors of Sumatra carried that silence like a second skin, heavier than hunger, sharper than grief. In the months after liberation, hospitals across Singapore and Australia filled with skeletal women whose bodies survived but whose eyes hadn't come home. Vivian Bullwinkle sat among them, her legs still scarred from the Bangka massacre, her voice hoarse from months of malnutrition. Yet, when investigators came, she forced herself to speak. Her statement at the War Crimes Tribunal was calm, surgical. She described the massacre on the beach, the starvation, the disease, and then the order. Each woman with 2 children choose one. The courtroom fell still. Even the Japanese interpreters struggled to breathe. No mother should ever choose, she said, her words trembling but unbroken. And yet, they made us live with that question every day. Documents from the trials confirmed it. The selection order had been real, recorded as a psychological method of control. The judges called it a form of torture intended to destroy moral resistance. For the first time, the suffering of those women had an official name. But justice didn't feel like healing. The world moved on fast. Reporters wanted headlines about heroism, not moral collapse. Many survivors never spoke of it again. Some rebuilt lives quietly, married, raised new families, avoided questions. Others wrote diaries hidden for decades. One Dutch woman's entry read, "I still hear the sergeant's voice. Some nights I still choose." Vivian dedicated the rest of her life to nursing, refusing to let cruelty define her service. When asked why she kept returning to hospitals, she said, "Because someone has to put the world back together." In her later interviews, she never named the guards, she named the women. Their names, their songs, their pact. Even a Japanese guard testified decades later, "We thought they were weak. They proved us wrong." The impossible order that once sought to break them became the proof of something unkillable: empathy under pressure, defiance through love. The choice that no mother should make had revealed the one truth war could never erase. Humanity survives by refusing to obey when obedience means losing the soul. And so, in every story told since, their silence still sings